Thank you very much. I'm a local from Burleigh Heads, so just around the corner. So like other speakers, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Kumameri Yugambeh language group, beautiful part of the world and quite significant in this area. I'll skip over a couple of slides. My background, I'm speaking with a few hats. I always get confused what hat I'm wearing different times. I'm largely going to talk about it from one of the groups I'm co-founder of, Datawi, that's sharing medical data from Queensland Health and other jurisdictions with researchers, really enabling that AI innovation. So I'm going to talk a lot about that and the learnings of governance and management of AI in that scenario. But as mentioned before, I've had an IT assurance business still own that for 25 years. It's national across Australia. And I'm also I'm an entrepreneur effectively, a technologist. At heart, I'm an engineer. I sit home on the weekends cutting code, and my wife goes, "You're working?" "No, no, this is hobby." It's sort of thing like that. But effectively, I'm an entrepreneur. I'm an angel investor in some other AI businesses and whatnot. My experience originally came out of defence, was my background with avionics, combat systems, missile defence systems. And when I formed the assurance business, we worked across a lot of other sectors like finance, but did a lot in healthcare. So working a lot with clinical information systems over the years and seeing that evolution towards collecting a clinical information system, towards electronic medical records, and ultimately that sort of golden vision that healthcare has of this secondary use of our data to build more effective personalised medicine. But equally doing some work in the Indigenous space and the public sector, public safety space with CCTV cameras. And what underlies all of this is data sensitivity and data sovereignty. These are key issues that sit across these data sets. We work with lots of different types of data. So there was some talks about the natural language processing space, and I wear a hat. I'm the director of the Queensland AI Hub, which is about growing the industry and capability here in Queensland in how AI plays in that future for us. And probably in the AI space in the last 2 or 3 years, the natural language processing has been one of the biggest advances in the area. So these tools that the guys were showing earlier are quite remarkable tools. We're still yet to really understand how we're going to utilise them and what the context of perhaps their threats and risks are. But certainly for us in the medical space, natural language processing is also key. The Gold Coast Hospital here receives about 12,000 GP referral letters per month and employ 48 people to shuffle them around and send them to the right department. 30% of them are still faxed. So that's sort of the technology that we're still working in that environment. But we can see huge potential around how natural language processing can improve our healthcare system. A lot of data sits in systems as relational data. We're working now on actually putting AI cameras above beds to be like a second nurse monitoring behaviour of the patient. We work a lot with medical imaging data, so echocardiograms. The quality of that video is not that great. Doing a lot with echocardiograms with the Alfred Cardiology Hospital. And here we're talking about big data. Each echocardiogram is about 2 gigabytes. We've got 130,000 of those to sort of process and train models on. They want to combine that with chest MRIs of hearts. We've got 7,000 of those. Every one of those is 500 gigabytes of data. So you're talking about like half a truckload of sort of hard drives of data. So how you process that and move that's quite complex. We deal a lot with IoT data. So we collect all the ECG data off the bedside monitors in ICU at 240 hertz. But also audio is another big thing. Speech recognition, listening to sounds. There's a group that's really looking at biodiversity, auditable biodiversity credits, where we have acoustic sensors out of our environment to monitor biodiversity, things like that, to understand how our species are changing. Back to the healthcare space, probably if you know, I haven't presented like a lot of references and things like that, but many surveys, when you ask the general population, where do you think AI might have the biggest impact, inevitably people would say healthcare is where it should have its biggest impact. And certainly it's received a massive amount of investment over the years in sort of the startup and sort of early venture investment space. If we look at the adoption through the regulator, the FDA, you know, that's been reasonably slow. A lot more of this is focused on vendors and suppliers. I just want to note the top one, 2014, the very first vendor to get FDA approval for an AI device was this Cardia device. I don't know if anyone's got that here, but the inventor of that is literally about 10 kilometres away here at Southport, works out of a shed, sold millions of these devices. It's huge in the US, co-invested by the Mayo Clinic, you know, one of the leaders in this space. They got an infringement lawsuit against Apple at the moment because Apple made all this thing about the watch. They completely infringed AliveCore's IP. That's in trial at the moment in the US, so it'll be interesting to watch that one. But yeah, curious, they're one of our partners. But AI, pretty much the state of the art in AI, is now we talk a lot about data-centric AI. We need to collect data, real data, and how do we label that data, and we were talking about that, to build these new models. So some of these models might be just classification things around text. We also look at a lot of things like predictive models into the future. Might this patient survive? Might this patient develop septic shock in the next 48 hours? Another study we're doing is looking at after heart surgery, like valve replacement, will they get atrial fibrillation within 48 hours, which is quite a serious complication. We can intervene with drugs to do that, but those drugs are quite toxic. So if we had predictive models that could actually determine whether we should provide those drugs or not, that's quite important. So these are the kinds of models that we're looking at, but it really depends on data. And if we really want to talk about personalised medicine, we've really got the counter to that is we have to deal with personal health information and how we manage that. Because it's no point having data that's aggregated and population-based. That's the old way of doing healthcare, is all of our studies about survival rates for cancers, we look at different subgroups and population groups, and we look at risk outcomes for them. And it's not really a personalised medicine approach that takes into account this person in front of me, what kind of cancer do they have, what grade it is, what comorbidities do they have, what particular drug regimes are they on at the moment, and what is that personalised survival outcome for that person, or what are the treatment options and how might that improve or reduce their chance of survival. So really the key to personalised medicine is how do we get down to the individual's data. But you can see the flip side of that is now we have a privacy issue about how do we share personalised information. So we're stuck between this conundrum, you know, about how we share data. And there's huge amounts of data in our hospitals. But the flip side of that FDA improvement and all this investment is that there is very little AI in our hospitals here in Australia at the moment. Very, very little. We are seeing it in radiology areas and so on, but our hospital systems, you know, there's old technology there. A lot of the electronic medical systems are really based on system designs from 20, 30 years ago. They're very large organisations. It's like turning the Titanic in the technology area, but they're very large institutional organisations. The Gold Coast Hospital's annual budget is about $1.5 billion. Queensland Health's budget's about $11 billion. You know, that investment in IT and trying to change direction is quite complex. But that change of direction is also complicated by institutional thinking where we're not really keeping up with changes of technology, and also the regulation is not keeping up to provide the appropriate guardrails to the people at the coalface, the public servants, the administrators, the clinicians, so that they can actually make decisions without being hung out to dry because of the vagueness and the greyness in our legislation and protective mechanisms. So we've really got big gaps in our regulatory frameworks, our jurisdictional frameworks, in how we deal with these new technologies and new problems. So the challenge is this data, we want to get it. It's everywhere, right? But it's not in one place. There's different systems. You'd like to think there's one system in Queensland Health that holds my data and an index for everything else. It doesn't work like that. There's probably 50 different systems. You might need to go to the anaesthetic system if I've been through surgery, or then when I end up in ICU, that data's in a separate system. There is a sort of a larger system, but if I want my pathology results, that's in AusLab. So this data is all over the place. Getting access to that data is quite onerous. There's different custodians for different data sets. So I'm working in ICU, but if I want to attach an X-ray, I need to go to the custodian that owns the imaging data, the radiology department, and get a separate sign-off and approval to that data to get access to it. The data's very noisy and dirty, and we were chatting about that at our group. Everyone sort of learns how to do AI and this auto ML from nice clean data sets. The reality is when you look at real data, it's dirty and it needs cleaning. But you don't want to start using it just because it's dirty. You want to start using it, but you've got to realise I've just got to be able to work with the dirty data, because even when I build the model, I need to put it into production. It's still not going to have to work with dirty data. And a lot of the coding that's in the data sets, oftentimes there's 10 or 20% error rate. You go, how could there be high rates of error in our medical data? And in fact, being in hospital is one of the unsafest places you can be. It's the 4th largest cause of death is preventable medical error. Now, when you look in the medical data, something simple like, is there suspected of COVID? You think that's a simple question to ask. But if I created a coding field and I've got to train all my staff, that's the field to put it in, they might tick the box, suspected COVID, but 3 hours later they get a PCR test that's negative. Does anyone turn that flag off? So time and when that data is collected is very important, and this is where we need to use AI to be able to interpret this data to make better assumptions of how things are working. So we started out with ICU across Queensland. We set up a public-private partnership. A bunch of private companies, along with support from Queensland Government, looked at how do we have this huge asset in Queensland of large digital records. How do we actually get more engagement with the researchers to really start using that data in a different way? So we raised about $8 million, and the first area we focused on was ICU. So we now have all of the state's ICU data into one data set that is shareable with external legitimate researchers that have gone through a governance process, and I'll outline that a bit more. But a lot of, why did we pick ICU? Well, there's a lot of data points when people are in ICU. If you're outpatient, say, in post-coronary care, you'll find that the information about you becomes sparse. We might prescribe you a drug, but we don't know that you actually took the drug, so compliance is a big issue. We're focusing in inpatient ICU. We've got a very controlled data set that we can do a lot of interpretation. So our data set effectively goes right down to the ECG data. So we've got this digital twin about a patient. We've got about 180,000 patients in the data set, so all of the Queensland patients for the last 8 years. And issues I'll talk about in a sec. Literally, we're hoping to have New South Wales up on board on the platform, which will represent about 50% of Australians' ICU patients. But the text message I just got sent literally 30 minutes ago was, who owns the IP of the models that we built of our data? So I'll come back to that point later on. So we're building this deeper data set, be one of its largest types in the world. It'll extend out to here. And we're not stopping with Australian hospitals. We're trying to build that elsewhere. So it becomes this very valuable research set for model developers to build that next generation of models. So let's step back a bit now and think through some of these issues. So the first issue that you often have in dealing with this data is private data, private health information. So what enables us to go and share that data or give access to that data to a researcher? And really when you read the legislation, so in Queensland it comes down to the Privacy Act, the Public Health Act, and there's a HHS, which is like a Local Health Areas Act. So in that, there's really two modes to look at about how we access patient data. One is an explicit consent model, where you get an explicit sign over, we're happy for you to use our data. If you get that, you don't have to do anything to the data. The patient's consented to you to share that data with researchers. That can be really complex when you're dealing with large groups of patients and things like that, time to take a study. So many studies are done under what's called a consent waiver approach, where a human research ethics committee and the site approval would approve a consent waiver. But the conditions on that are also that the data's been de-identified and it's shared only with researchers to build that product. So there's quite specific requirements about that sharing. And look, this, in many ways in our legislation, it's very unclear about what defines de-identified data. So under the Privacy Act, if data's de-identified, it's not actually considered personal information. So it actually doesn't even get covered by the Privacy Act. The Privacy Act says nothing to see here. But if data got re-identified and now becomes personally identifiable again, now it gets sucked back into the Privacy Act and there's obligations. So the Privacy Act doesn't actually prescribe to you about what the de-identification process is, but talks about, it's not saying absolute, because if you get enough data points about a person, you'll probably be able to statistically identify them. The Privacy Act recognises that and doesn't exclude that, but it says, is there a low risk of re-identification? And they really rely on that being an expert judgment. Where in the US, there's the HIPAA Act, the Health Information Portability Act, and it's actually very prescriptive about what you need to do to the data to then share that with other counterparties. So on one side, we've got US legislation that's very prescriptive, Australia that's very vague and sort of leaves it open. And then there's sort of different things in the middle, like the UK, the European Union under GDPR. Even under GDPR, which is many people see as quite strong around consumer privacy, they're actually more advanced than Australia in how we share and distribute data. And I think part of that is the education process of our governance groups and things like that, and their ability to sort of process that. That being said, the UK Parliament at the moment is doing a legal reform of data sharing policy because pretty much what they found during COVID is a lot of the restrictions on how we shared medical data actually slowed down our response to how we dealt with the COVID epidemic in how we shared that with legitimate researchers. So there's actually a lot of legal reform going on in this area at the moment. So I won't go through HIPAA. I think timing-wise, I'll keep moving on. There's really guidance just about what elements we de-identify and strip out and so on. So we pretty much use this process predominantly in our systems. But in addition to HIPAA, we use a framework around that, which is pretty much an Australian framework that's been pushed forward called the 5 Safes model. And data is one of the safe elements, but then you want to think about the other considerations on how you're sharing or giving access to that data. So the other aspects of it are you dealing with safe people? Are these legitimate researchers that might have been through some vetting process or completed some contractual requirement for their approval to access the data? Are they safe projects? Are they safe institutions? Are they operating on the data in a safe environment where there's other controls placed around the data that reduces the risk of access? So we don't look at data de-identification just in isolation. We consider it in this risk framework about the context of how it's shared. And when I say sharing, even that is quite confusing in the governance framework within IT and the legal side of. So in many of our situations, we don't call it data sharing at all, because sharing is almost the implicit element that you've given the data to somebody else. And pretty much that's the past of how data was shared. You would get a research project approved at the hospital. They'd sign off on it. If it's de-identified, internally they'd de-identify the data. They'd put it on a USB stick and give it to you. And then there's no life cycle control about what happens to that data after that point. We talk more now about data access agreements, where more how do we open up our environments for you to come in to work on the data, but the life cycle of your access to that data and how that data is tracked and monitored is controlled. So we've seen a shift from data sharing to data access. So we more move in this environment. 10 minutes to go. And again, you know, there's a lot of reporting from a governance point of view that we want to provide, that we can provide around those safe environments, safe people and so on, to actually track and monitor that reporting from a governance level. But this is an interesting space. There's a lot of other technologies that are evolving where we don't actually share or give them access to the data at all. When we train a model, the model's given to the hospital and they train the model and then give them back the trained model, and the model builder never gets to see the data. And similarly, there's synthetic data that we take a data set and we generate a synthetic version of the data set, which is not real patients, but it kind of has all the attributes of what a real patient would look like. But these are really still early emerging technologies and really struggling to be ready yet for larger scale use. Okay, the other aspect, and this comes back to AI, you know, listening to the talk this morning, you know, put your document in, summarize it. Do we trust that that summary is going to be a good legal interpretation of that document? Are we trying to engineer the lawyer out of that loop? And I think that's always a failure of design of AI. Wherever I see AI trying to design the humans out of the loop, it typically fails. Really what we want to do is engineer AI to support the human in the loop. And it's actually how do we actually amplify and accelerate the human in undertaking their task rather than trying to take the task away from them. But really you need to ask from a governance point of view, and this is the retraining of the HRECs and the site approvals, is for them to really think through about, is this an appropriate use of technology in our environment? You know, if we go to the CCTV cameras at the moment, there's a lot of reform around the use of facial recognition technology and things like that. So as soon as you start touching the fringe of, does this meet you know, community expectations on how that is applied, that is something that the HREC really needs to start evaluating in the use of those technologies. Is it safe? In the legal context, is that an accurate representation? In the health context, is that a safe use of that tool? Is it accurate? Is it transparent? Do we record actually when that tool was used and being upfront with people that there is AI automation involved in this decision-making process? And we retain an audit trail of its use. And then another point here that we're seeing coming up in many jurisdictions, which I get a bit frustrated with, I think this is lawyers trying to throw in there, oh, we need to make it explainable. We debate this a lot in healthcare, that you're seeing a lot of legislative change saying AI is a black box, it needs to be explainable. I've come from a safety critical systems engineering background for many decades, and you write software that even has 5 or 6 different conditional loops in it, that software is not explainable. You know, it's not really testable. And we've dealt with that for years, you know, for decades. It's more we've built an engineering and a qualification process around how we build trust around that. So it is really difficult to give a full explanation on something that's looking at a lot of data points over time to make it fully explainable. And I think trying to set that as a jurisdictional goal is actually wrong, and we need to be more nuanced in that. And it comes back to, we're setting this expectation for automation that's much higher. Because if I asked a doctor, how did you decide on how to give that drug to that person, they will reinvent logically the decision that they made, but it probably won't represent the decision that they actually made at the time. So we've sort of, you know, lifted the bar for technology, and we've set much higher expectations than what we had over our human processes. So this is a really sort of key thing to sort of keep in mind. And then the other aspect is it fair? What we're starting to find out is even these simple explainable tools like a PBG monitor that monitors your pulse oxygenation level doesn't work for different skin colours. It could be 1% out, which is quite significant. You know, these devices have been around for decades. The problem was it was never tested on a sample base that reflected diversity in the population. And we see that throughout healthcare. Now, oftentimes when you seek access to data and you're getting a privacy waiver, they will often exclude different minority groups from that data. So they might exclude Indigenous people or people with mental disabilities. But what you're actually doing is being recognised now as a fairness issue is you're taking them out of the model consideration. So now you're building a model that's implicitly unfair because it's not actually dealing with that population group. So this really decision about inclusion and exclusion criteria really needs to be evaluated to better understand fairness criteria. I talked about integrating in. The FDA regulation, traditionally all of our approvals of medical devices, drugs and so on relied on this pre-market certification component. You go through your quality system, you do the test, you show that your product or drug or whatever or your device meets the claims that you're putting on the packaging label and what evidence you've got for that. That's traditionally the process. You get your approval, your pre-market approval, you go to market. The challenge is now machine learning inherently has a behaviour change component to it. The way we treat patients changes over time. So we don't want our machine learning models to be static. We want them to be continually learning and then adapting to new drugs and new therapeutics that are improving the outcomes for patients over time. So the FDA is switching to this model of beyond pre-market certification, we actually want to do market surveillance to monitor the AI in production and whether it's continuing to perform better. So this is quite a big change, and I think we've seen this also with implants and other devices. Everyone's got through pre-market certification, but nobody's monitoring the failures and things like that. So really moving towards this process of continuous monitoring. And pretty much one of the reasons why AI hasn't penetrated the hospital is that probably 99% of AI research projects have only ever been tested in one hospital. They publish in Nature or something like that, this remarkable result, but then you try to move it to another hospital and it doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is these machine learning models are very brittle to the domain distribution that we built it on. So I talked about there's a data set in the US, the MIMIC data set, hundreds of publications. This is an example. Less than 1% of those models have been distributed to other hospitals. But the reason is if I train my model on that MIMIC data, and let's say about predicting sepsis, when I apply, and this is what we've done, when we apply it to our data, we don't get the same results. And the reason why we don't get the same results is our patients are different. We've got a different presentation model to intensive care in our public health system to what they have in Boston. We use different kinds of drug regimes. We've got different ethnic diversity, and even different hospitals, like the Royal Brisbane Hospital is a burns unit. Its infections are quite different to the Gold Coast, quite different again to Townsville, which is tropical medicine. So these nuances need to be taken in place. We talked about transfer learning. Really the goal is that we need to fit and calibrate our models for their local application in the hospital. Explainability, fairness. Okay, I'll finish on ownership. This one's a very contentious one, and this comes up all the time. In fact, I said the text message I just had from New South Wales Health. So there's always a big question about who owns the data. And what health often move away from this use of owner, and they talk about custodians of data. And there's also a definition of a data steward. So the original custodian might apply a steward to actually act in their interests. So these are, I'm not a lawyer, I've just been buried under a whole lot of legal jargon in trying to do work. But these are really important concepts to really get right. And ultimately where we're trying to get to with Queensland Health was to move to a data steward model, because otherwise if you want to do a multi-site, you've got to go to so many different people, to so many different custodians to get individual sign-off. For certain classes of disease and data sets, you want to group that into a data trust where there's other stewards that have been appointed to act on the behalf of the custodians. But the question inevitably comes up is from the hospital, oh, my data's worth a lot of money. I can make a lot of money from selling it. But an individual data item, even an entire hospital's data, is not worth that much on its own. And the reason for that is you need, if someone's building therapeutics or diagnostics, they're going to need to test it across a lot of hospitals. And they're going to need a lot of variation. But also, some data items are worth more than others. In the value chain, we might pay a cardiologist to label some data, and the cost of that label costs money. The raw data, just looking at it on its own, is not worth a lot. But if I add a good label onto it, it becomes worth a lot more. If I connect it to a genome sequence, it becomes worth a lot more. So that enrichment process is a big process. But even that point, I have to pay a cardiologist a lot more than, say, a registrar or somebody even less skilled to do something. So different data points have different value items around it. But if I've got straight roads, like driving, and I just have lots of labels about that, they're not worth that much. What I want are the really corner cases, things like that. So value of data really changes. But then it comes back to this problem about when we build a model, we've disconnected from the data, but we needed the data to build it. But now what are these models worth? And this is sort of the conundrum point we're at the moment, is now the custodian at this side is saying, well, if I give away this data, I want to own this data. And in the chain of IP development, you can see how we're going to get stuck in that IP ownership, but something not well understood. I could probably talk about this issue for another 20 minutes, but I've been getting a wind up, so I might finish up there.